So today is lesson 7. It's our last lesson before reading week. We've just got a regular lesson today. There's no midterm exam. But I do want to look a bit at what's coming up. Yeah, today's kind of an important class, so you don't want to miss it. For sure. So if you're watching the video, please make sure you do go through the in-class activities and try practicing the code in our restaurant app, and message me if you need any help. So I just want to have a quick look at what's going on. So I am all that's standing between you and reading week, so we'll have no class next week. After reading week, we're going to look at I will have to add a lesson 8 folder back in here. So we're going to look at scrolling and navigation. So far we've just kind of used floating action buttons for moving around, but we're going to look at some built-in navigation tools like adding a nav bar, and also scrolling, which was one of the things someone mentioned they had an issue with in the comments in our app, was scrolling was a problem. So we'll look at how we can set intelligent scrolling. And then your assignment 2 is going to be due in week 10. So I will just double check the date of that on the syllabus. So you should be working on your app and making progress on your first version of that prototype. But I'll just confirm that we've got that as the correct date. So that we're basically looking at about 2 weeks from now, that you've got a working version with at least some working functionality. So yeah, your assignment 2 actually is due November the 12th. So I'll just update that item. So you've got 2 weeks to show that you've made some progress and you have some working, oh, it does say the 12th, I'm sorry. That should say Thursday. That's why I was confused. You've got a couple more weeks, so your app should be in progress. Okay, I am available next week. If you're working on it next week, I will still be available for appointments. It does not have to be complete. So you can refer to the instructions on assignment 2. There has to be some working functionality. So you cannot leave your app and build the whole thing at the end of the semester. Okay, so if we have a quick look at what you've been asked to do for assignment 2. Okay. So you've got to have started building the activities within your app. Your UI should be similar to what you added in your mockups, and you're going to resubmit your mockups to me so I can compare how does your app look to the mockups that you submitted. What is Word doing with my file? I should be able to register and log in either using a username and password or using a Google account. And we're going to look at doing both of those things today. And there should be some ability to view data from your database and add data. Doesn't mean all of that functionality has to be there on every activity, but I should be able to, on at least one activity, insert and read data. Okay, so in terms of what that functionality looks like in your app, it really just depends on the app that you're building. Okay, so within 2 more weeks, I'd like to see a prototype that has these features. And that is 20% of your mark. And then there's another 20% for the final version of your app. Now, just before we get into our topic for today, which is Firebase authentication, we do want to do some more work. We're not quite finished where we were last week with displaying data. So we used the RecyclerView last week. We wrote some code, but many people who did the lesson on their own and they emailed their work to me, they said the RecyclerView was the hardest part, that the code is complex and that's the most challenging thing. And I absolutely agree. That makes total sense to me. So what we want to do, we're going to open up our app. We've worked with the RecyclerView once and we've set up our second RecyclerView, but we haven't actually coded it. So we're going to code it again. We're going to code that for extra practice. And we'll also talk again about the 3 classes that are involved in displaying a list of data with a RecyclerView. So I'm going to open up Android Studio. Fortunately, there don't appear to be any updates to Android Studio this week for a change. So let's open up last week's project. I've also got my test project that I'll come back to a bit later so that I can show you what the authentication is going to look like once we're done with our RecyclerView. So here's our Restaurant Rater app. That's interesting. I'll just build my app before I run it. I'm going to get it launched in my emulator. So what we did in class last week, we created a comment class. I think I just provided the code to you for this. It's pretty similar to our restaurant class. We had a restaurant ID, so this will serve as a link between our comments collection and our restaurants collection, kind of like a foreign key. We don't really call it that in a NoSQL database, but it will work like a foreign key. And we created our restaurant activity that would display the name of the restaurant at the top. And then we had a couple inputs where a user could put in their name and comments. And then down below, we had a RecyclerView. And inside our RecyclerView, we were displaying the name. Whoops, sorry, that's the wrong RecyclerView. We had this item comment that has 2 text views that renders the name and the comments for each restaurant. My Gradle build is super slow this morning. It's still building, so I can't run the app yet. But in our restaurant activity, we haven't written any code here yet that will populate the RecyclerView we've put in the layout. So that RecyclerView is just going to be empty. Okay, I'll finally launch my app. I'll also open up a window to my Firebase console. So that if we need to look in our database, we can do that. So I'll go find my app. So here's our list of restaurants, our first recycler view. Okay, so obviously some of you have taken my project off of GitHub and you've got my Google services.json file, which means your app is connected to my Firebase database. If you are going to take my code from GitHub, that's okay, but you need to replace the Google services JSON so that you're interacting with your own database. Because not only does this kind of mess with my data, but you also can't see it because you don't have access. You haven't been granted access to the database in the Firebase console. So you would have no way to look at this database in Firebase. So if you're using my project, you need to make sure that you go into your own database on the Firebase console. And in the project settings, here's the Google services.json. So you're going to need to download this file to your project and overwrite my own Google services.json file so that you're connected to your database instead of to mine. So please make sure you do that if you are running your version of the app from my GitHub repository. So when I click on one of the restaurants, it uses an extra to pass the name here. And then I was able to add comments into the database last week. So if I go and look in my Firestore database, so I've got one comment already for this restaurant. I'll add another one. So the code to save our comments should be working. So here's my new comment. But our recycler view, which is down below, it's empty. There's no code in here yet. So maybe we want to write the code to populate it, but before we do, I'd like to go over just to review again how RecyclerView works and what the pieces are. So I'm just going to go back to our slides from last week. Which are on Blackboard for your reference, but let's have a look at them. Oh, well, it would help if I had saved them somewhere. Okay, well, let's look at the official docs, actually. So let's look at the docs that talk about populating a recycler view. So we're really using three different classes here. We've got the recycler view, which is the physical control that we've got in our right in our XML layout template. So here's our activity restaurant. So here's our recycler view. So it's basically just a container that's going to display some kind of list of data. So there's no format or style to it. So to define the style of each element in the list, this is what we've got our item comment.xml for. So this is like a template. It's using a linear layout. So it's like a grid. We can lay it out either horizontally or vertically, where we define that each item in our list is going to have two different text views. So this is kind of like our display template for our RecyclerView class. Sorry, it said to close my window. It's getting a little cold in here. So the RecyclerView is the actual user interface component, the view that winds up showing up in our browser. Sorry, in our app. So we used to use a list view control in older versions. The Recycler is new. It's got more features. If you look in older tutorials, you may see a list view. But RecyclerView is kind of the standard now for Android in terms of displaying a list. So in order to interact programmatically with the different views in our list with these two text boxes, this is where our ViewHolder class comes in. So the ViewHolder lets us identify each individual object or view and interact with it programmatically. So in this case, we want to be able to render the username field into our first text view, and we want to be able to render the comment body into our second text view. So the ViewHolder class is that interface. It's that bridge between our data and a single item that's embedded inside of the RecyclerView. And then our third class that we're working with, which is probably somewhat familiar, is the adapter class. So the adapter class really allows us to take a query result and take some kind of list control, which is our recycler class, and it serves as that bridge that binds them together. So we populate our adapter from the query result, and then we bind the adapter to the RecyclerView. So if we go back and have a look at how we're already doing this over in our list activity, let's just kind of have a quick review of what's going on here. So here's our list activity that lists all our restaurants. And in here, here's our RecyclerView. And our RecyclerView is using, we see what's happening here. So when our adapter class gets created, we're overriding the onCreate method. So here, the first thing we're doing is we're inflating, or we're connecting our RecyclerView to our item restaurant. So at runtime, this template will get applied for every element in the RecyclerView. And then when our activity gets created, we're running a query with Firestore. We're binding it. We're binding our RecyclerView adapter to our query result. And when we call bind, this onBind ViewHolder method, it's going to run for every row in our data set. And this is where our ViewHolder class comes in. So when our ViewHolder is bound, we're going to identify each view, the text view and the seek bar that we've got over here. Sorry, our rating bar and our text view. And we're binding them to the properties of the current instance of our class. And then lastly, this part was optional. We've added the click handler so the user can touch or click any element in the list, and it's going to open the next activity. Okay, so our RecyclerView is our list container. Our RecyclerView adapter connects our query to our RecyclerView, and the RecyclerView holder lets us interact with each element in our list, where we can identify and manipulate each element in our activity. And typically what we're going to want to do is bind it to a specific value from the query. Okay, so that's how all these three pieces are sort of working together. And it is quite a bit of code in order to do it. It is complex because we've had to use these two separate classes. One of type RecyclerView holder and one of type Firestore RecyclerAdapter. So the constructors are kind of long and messy. Does anybody have questions about any of these three classes, about RecyclerView, RecyclerViewHolder, or Firestore RecyclerAdapter? We are going to practice with them again in a minute. Okay, Edwin, that's a great question. What do we do if we have two different collections? It's possible here when we write the query. So I've just queried the particular collection, yes, but it is possible to write a more advanced query. So we would define it in here. The rest of our code would actually be the same. The other thing we might need is we might need sort of a hybrid class that we could populate from the query result, kind of like a view model in ASP.NET. If our query result had properties from different collections. Yes, it's the query. The other thing is I've chosen to structure this database with different collections. You could also use nested collections, in which case the query is simpler because you could write a query and include any child nodes if you wanted to. So there's a couple of options, but basically you would do that in the query. It doesn't really affect the RecyclerView, the adapter, or the ViewHolder. Excellent question. Are there any other questions? If I gave you a quiz question and said, explain what the RecyclerView, RecyclerViewHolder, and ViewHolderAdapter do you think you could identify the difference between the three? I'll come to your questions in a minute. Okay, Edwin, so line 35. Yes, this would change. So this is probably where that's where I was suggesting you might need to define a custom class that contains the elements you want from the two different collections. And you would have to bind to that new hybrid class object. Yes, that's what I'm thinking, Michael. Yes. Similar, if you've ever worked with a view model in the .NET framework, same thing. So let's say in an ASP.NET application, you want to render data from two different tables that are related. You can define a view model that includes the properties you want from your first class, as well as the properties you want from a second class. You define those in a view model, and then your view is bound to that view model rather than to one of the individual models. So you could do the same thing here. Misam, I'm not sure I understand the context of your question in terms of RecyclerView. Could you clarify what you mean? Okay, well, for the moment, I want to focus on the RecyclerView. It's a good question, but now probably isn't the time for me to address that question. Okay, so what we want to do now is practice again with the RecyclerView, because we have a RecyclerView on our restaurant activity, but it's empty. There's no code running to populate it. So we've done the layout part, we've created the recycler view in our activity restaurant, and we've defined the template, the list template called item underscore comment, which has two text views, one that shows the username and one that shows the body. We have these things, and all of this, the XML you needed for all of this, it was on Blackboard in last week's folder. So we just kind of copied and pasted and downloaded them. But if we examine the code in our restaurant activity, our Kotlin file, we don't have any of the code that populates that recycler view. So we're going to go through the process again, just like we populated our list of restaurants. We also want to populate the list of comments. So we're going to work with these classes, RecyclerView, Firestore RecyclerAdapter, and RecyclerViewHolder, again for practice. So let's open up our restaurant activity, and let's define some of the things that we're going to need. So at the class level, I'll create an adapter. Actually, wait, I'll do this. First, we'll define the classes. So we need our two inner classes. We need our ViewHolder and we need our ViewAdapter. Our RecyclerAdapter. So I'm going to create So first I'm going to create the ViewHolder class. So this is going to be a RecyclerView.ViewHolder. So this is going to allow us to interact with the individual elements in our template file, our XML template. We're going to need to make a few imports. So we'll import the recycler view. Now we've got a couple of options here. Whether it's a standard Android view or whether it's the Firestore core view. It's just a regular Android view we're referencing here. We want to just reference those text views inside. We've also now got to define the class for our adapter. So we'll call it comments adapter. We'll set out the constructor here, and we're going to set up some options. So this adapter uses the Firestore recycler options, and we're going to bind it to the comment data type. So our adapter is expecting a list, and that list will contain comment objects. So we're going to be passing the comment class, instances of the comment class, to our restaurant activity comments ViewHolder. And then we're going to set out the options. So this is complaining because we've set out this class, but it doesn't actually, it needs to, every time we're instantiating an instance of this member, we've got to implement the members. So the two members that we need are the onCreate method and the onBind method. So we could add those methods manually, or I can just let Android Studio, if I click implement members here, and I'll select both my onCreate and onBind, so Android Studio can write those method signatures for us. So again, to get here, I can just mouse over my error, and I could click Alt-Shift-Enter, or I can click this Implement Members. And I want both of these members on Create and on Bind. So now our error goes away, and we get these to-dos, because we get the method signatures, but there's no method bodies in here. So we need to write our own. So in the onCreate ViewHolder method, there's two things that should happen. We're going to replace this line of code here on line 30. What two things should happen when our ViewHolder gets created? This would be similar. Okay, Tim, you're on the right track. Yes, right. We want to inflate. So Edwin, and what does that mean in plain language? Inflate's kind of a bizarre term, but you're right. Not quite. We're not quite sending the data yet. You're on the right track. I'll give you a hint. It has to do with our item comment XML file. It has to do with this file. What do we need to do when our ViewHolder gets instantiated, even before we have any data? The data is going to come in our next step. Right, CDRM, that's great. Okay, so we need to connect the item comment.xml template to the RecyclerView. And for some reason, I never spell RecyclerView right. So Edwin, you were right about inflating, but the inflating isn't about the data. The inflating is actually connecting up the layout template to the container that holds it. So we're going to use the layout inflator, and we are going to call the inflate method. Whoops. We're going to call from our parent context, and now we call inflate. So we're going to inflate the RecyclerView with our item comment XML. Whoops, this should be lowercase, sorry. So set up the XML template. So we've now defined what each item in the RecyclerView will look like. This happens at runtime. So that's the first thing. Now we're getting an error here. So what's the error telling us we still need to do? Yep, you're right, Jamie, because it returns so we are going to return our comments view holder with the view. So once this happens, our item comment XML template is now connected to our recycler view. There's actually no connection between these two until line 32 runs. That's what links them together. They get, so they're, the inflator links the template into the recycler view at runtime. Now, why Android chose to do it this way, I don't fully understand. If I was going to design this, to me, it would make a lot more sense if in our restaurant activity, I'd like to see the I'd like to see the recycler view have a property like, you know, template equals yeah, it doesn't know what that is. We should just be able to bind it at runtime through the property. But unfortunately, the way the recycler view works, we can't. It's got to happen at runtime that the template gets populated. Okay. So what about in our bind view holder? Excuse me, what should happen in here? So when this object gets created, right, you got it, Edwin. Exactly. I'm going to copy that comment exactly, because that's exactly right. We want to assign values to the view holder elements. Exactly. So now that our recycler view is holding our item comment, we need to populate the individual views, the username text view and the body text view, from the comment object that gets passed in. And that object is predefined. The parameter name is called a model because it's generic. So we'll take the holder.item view. So item view refers to the current item in the view holder that is being bound to one object in the data set, in the adapter. So we're going to bind it. And because our model is of type comment, when I hit model dot, we get all the properties. So we're going to bind it to the username. We'll do the same thing for the comment body. So our body text view.text will be equal to the model's body property. Now we're still not done. If we run the app right now, our recycler view still isn't going to populate, even though our code I think looks good. Why won't the recycler view show anything yet? I can run this, but I don't think we're going to see any changes. In fact, I know we're not going to see any changes. Right, okay, Ken, yeah, that's part of it. There's no listeners, so we're not listening for changes. What else are we missing? Not only the listeners. Yep, we've got no adapter. And we're missing even one other thing that we need even before the adapter. Right. You got it. You guys have hit it. So we've got no query, no adapter to bind to, and no listeners. Okay, so we've defined the class. These things will get invoked once we have those other elements in here, where we have set up an adapter, write a query, bind it to the adapter, bind the adapter here, and then listen for changes. So we're still going to have to do those things. So this is a good setup. It's a good start. I'll actually push what I've done to Git. I can push it to GitHub right now if you're just a bit behind. So this is lesson 7.1. Comment holder and adapter starter. Okay, so now we need those other elements so that the code we've written around creating our ViewHolder and our RecyclerAdapter can run. Just a quick question so far before we move into that. And this is particularly directed to the people who said the RecyclerView was the hardest part, or that's the part that confused me, which I totally agree with. I understand. I think it's the most complicated thing we've done in this course so far. So if you were one of those people, are you feeling, is this helping at all so far, what we've done so far? Are you any more clear on the RecyclerView, the holder, and the adapter than you were before class today? You can answer in the chat. You can even answer privately. Okay, fair enough. Yep. Okay, now we're not finished yet, so that may also help for us to complete the rest of the activity, because we've set up these two classes, but they're not actually being invoked yet. We're not using them yet. So we'll get there. Okay, and by all means, at any point, stop me if anything I've said doesn't make sense or confuses you, or you want clarification. So now we're going to need to add the code, some code up at the top of our class, and then mostly within onCreate to run our query, to fetch the comments we need, bind them to an adapter so that our onCreate and onView methods actually get invoked. So we'll create a reference to our adapter at the class level. Oops. So it's going to be of type restaurantactivity.commentsAdapter. And we'll initialize it as being null, because we'll populate it in onCreate once we query Firestore. So we'll create our adapter here. We'll create it at the class level so it's available within all the methods of the class. And then we'll go to our onCreate method. I'll put it below. So this is all the code we've already added for adding a new comment. So this will be our section for querying Firestore for existing comments for the selected restaurant. We're going to set our recycler view. I'll be honest with you. I don't fully understand why we have to do this, and I've never yet to read anything that explains this to me. There's no definition in the recycler view here, but if we bind the recycler view to a template with linear layout, I don't really understand why we need to do this. But I think we do. I'll try taking it out later and we'll see the effects. Maybe we don't need to, but as far as I've always tried, we still have to set the layout of the recycler view. Hang on a second. I'll just double check how we did it in our list activity. Oh, we used equals. Right. Manager, this. And I'll do my import. Thank you, Edwin. Once we get this working, I'm going to disable this line and see what happens. I'm not entirely convinced we need it. So we'll write a query here. So I'm going to use where equal to, so I want to filter based on our restaurant ID. Where do we get the restaurant ID from? Right, because we don't want to see all the comments. We only want the comments that are related to the restaurant we're looking at. How do we know? Right, you got it, Ken. So we passed in an extra. So we can use our intent.getStringExtra. In our list activity in the bind ViewHolder here, right, when the user clicked on a restaurant, we created an extra called restaurant ID and we passed that to the intent. So we're going to use that as a where clause in our query. Thank you, Ken. Great explanation. So now we want to pass the query results to the adapter so that we can display it. So this is where we're going to set up our Firestore recycler options. So we're binding to the comment class. And we're setting our, passing in our query results and basically casting these as our comment class. Yeah, fair question. I don't know either. Some of the terminology is strange. And then finally, we're going to populate our adapter. So this is where we're passing our data to our comment adapter class. And we're passing in a list of options, a list of data of type comment. I totally agree. I hate the name view for a UI element. An element or a component makes much more sense to me, but this is what we're stuck with. So now we want to bind the comment adapter So first we're instantiating and populating our comments adapter, which means it calls onCreate first, it inflates or connects our item template. And then it binds the data one at a time to each comment model, which populates our two text views in our template. And then we're binding this adapter to our RecyclerView in our activity. So it's quite a process. It's not a simple, here's a UI component, here's a set of data, and we can just bind them. We've got about 5 different elements, and we've got to pass the data along the chain, binding it together in order to render. The other thing we need is 2 other methods. Same 2 methods we had in our other activity. I realize it's almost 12 and almost time for a break. We need to call onStop and onStart, because Ken mentioned earlier, we've got to start listening for changes to the data as well. I will push all this code. So we want to call on start. So we want to start listening. That's on stop gets called. So if the activity is stopped, meaning like we click a button to open a new activity, once the activity is stopped, it stops listening for data. So if there's another activity over top of it, our current activity will not basically be checking the database constantly for changes. As soon as that activity over top gets finished, let's say the user clicks back and that next activity goes to the back, gets removed from the back stack, then on start gets called again and our adapter will start listening for changes again. Because if it's not visible, there's no reason for it to keep that connection and be constantly checking for new data. Does that make sense? And so we'll say stop listening when activity is stopped. as another activity will be visible over top. Sorry, I probably should have put that comment in last week when I wrote those two methods. So if onStop is called for the activity, we're going to stop listening. All right, I'm going to give this a try. I think it looks good, but there's only one way to know for sure. I'll run my changes and try it again. Hopefully it's working. And well, we're about due for a break anyway, but I will just load it and see if it runs. So I'll reopen the app. I'll click on Jay's Burritos because I know I have a couple of comments in my database here. And now my recycler view gets updated. Right. Okay, they're all squished. So the issue may be, Tim, we'll just look at the height of a couple of elements. So make sure in your item comment that the layout itself, the linear layout, the height is wrap content. It should be wrap content on all three of these elements. No, it's related just to this restaurant, Misam. So if I go back to my list, right, okay, so that's why. If I go back to my list, I probably didn't code that button. So I get no comments. So the comments are particular to a restaurant. So if I make a comment here, I don't see the other comments in my database. The comments are saved because we are including the restaurant ID when we make a comment, because it gets passed to this activity. And in our query, right, that's why we've got in our query, we've got a where equal to. We're not querying all the comments. We're only querying comments based on the selected restaurant ID. Okay, we are going to take a 10-minute break. I will stop the recording. I will push everything we've done to GitHub so far. Let's take a little break and stretch our legs. Go get away from your computer for a few minutes. I'm going to do the same. We'll resume at 12:15. Okay?